Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on ecological drought, focused on drought, wildfire, and recovery, co-organized and co-hosted by NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS, and the USGS National Climate Adaptation Science Center, the National CASC. My name is Britt Parker, and I'm coordinator for the NIDIS Missouri River Basin and Pacific Northwest Drought Early Warning Systems. I oversee our drought and wildfire work as well. Joining me in welcoming you today is Sean Carter, the senior scientist at the National CASC. Sean and I will provide you with information on NIDIS, the CASC, this webinar series, and background on our speakers. And then our speakers will share with us research and practice related to the relationship between drought and wildfire and impacts to recovery post-fire. After the presentations, we'll open the webinar for your questions. We've had a bit of a last-minute change in our speaker lineup. Bill Tripp was unsure if he would be able to join us today, and thankfully he was. And we also have Paul Steblin, who was willing to join us literally with a couple hours notice, so we owe you one, Paul. So we will be hearing from Dr. Jeremy Littell, Paul Steblin, and Bill Tripp today. Throughout this webinar, all participants are muted, so if you have a question for the speaker, please write your questions in the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. And at the close of a webinar, a survey will pop up, and we ask that you take a moment to answer 5 brief questions to provide us with feedback on the webinar. Today's webinar is the third of 4 webinars focused on ecological drought. This series was organized to raise awareness of ecological drought, share recent research and effective practices, and identify future avenues for research and collaboration. The first 2 webinars, an introduction to ecological drought and then planning for resilience, were held in February, and we have a final webinar coming up in March, which will focus on the impacts of ecological drought to coastal ecosystems. We hope that you can join us. Attendees can download a handout through the GoToWebinar control panel with links to the recordings for registration for the final webinar and the NIDIS and the National CASC websites. A quick background on NIDIS. NIDIS was created by congressional law in 2006 with a mandate to help the nation prepare for, mitigate, and respond to the effects of drought. NIDIS achieves these goals through the development of regional drought early warning systems, shown on the map here, and through support to improve drought predictions and forecasting, effective drought planning and preparedness, and assessing the impacts of drought. All of our work is done in collaboration with a wide range of partners at all levels. I encourage attendees to explore the new and awesome U.S. drought portal at drought.gov, where NIDIS hosts a wealth of information on drought research from many different sources. And I do want to flag that in 2018, NIDIS released our Drought and Wildfire Nexus Strategic Plan. The goal of this plan is to improve the utilization of drought information in wildland fire management for the ecological health, public health, and firefighter safety. Under the strategy, we funded work to better understand how drought impacts post-fire recovery and therefore the long-term risk of post-fire debris flows, and to better understand how climate and weather interact to affect the fire season as just an example. We look forward to continuing to support research under this strategy. And now I'll ask Sean Carter to share information on the CASC and the CASC's excellent work on ecological drought. Thank you, Sean.
Thanks, Britt. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, our third webinar on eco drought. So I'm Sean Carter. I'm the Chief Scientist for the National Climate Adaptation Science Center based at the USGS headquarters in Reston, Virginia. My team there and I oversee climate impacts research and synthesis and help coordinate work at our 8 regional centers that are hosted by university consortia throughout the US. One of our recent national synthesis efforts is focused on the ecological consequences of drought when considering climate change and increasing human pressures. And today, it's my privilege to introduce now 3 speakers helping managers plan and adapt with the consequences of drought from a fire perspective. Jeremy Littell is a US Geological Survey climate impacts ecologist with our Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center, and he coordinates research on climate impacts on forest and mountain ecosystems, including the role of climate and wildfire and other forest disturbances. He also works to make climate information and future projections more accessible and useful to planners and decision makers. Paul Steblin is with the Wildland Fire Science Center at the USGS. working with about 150 scientists to produce essential information, data, and tools used by decision makers before, during, and after wildland fires. He served for 6 years on the governing board of the Joint Fire Science Program, and he has 30 years of experience addressing complex natural resource and land management issues in the Department of Interior, including Deputy Director of the DOI Office of Wildland Fire, and a wide variety of field, regional, and national positions in the National Wildlife Refuge System. And we're also happy to have Bill Tripp with us today. And he's the Director of Natural Resources and Environmental Policy with the Karuk Tribe, Department of Natural Resources. He serves as co-chair of the Western Region Strategy Committee, and he's co-lead of the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership. He's an advisor to the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network, and he does his best to stay engaged in many other forums progressing the good fire movement. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our first speaker, Jeremy Littell.
Thank you, Sean, for that introduction, and thanks to Elizabeth and Britt for helping get us set up and going, and thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can, but it's not yet in presentation mode. There we go. Perfect. Thank you.
All right. And I have GoToWebinar go away. I apologize that I don't have my camera running. It doesn't agree with GoToWebinar. So just voice and slides today. I'm going to talk today a little bit about drought and fire research, but then try and bridge the gap a little bit to some of the ecological drought conversations that you've heard in the prior two webinars, and then use that to think forward a little bit about the kinds of fire management challenges, both climate driven and also the ways that we may affect the outcomes of those challenges through adaptation going forward. So I also need to acknowledge a number of colleagues who have contributed to this work. I've summarized a lot of our collective efforts in the slides that I'm going to show you today, and should acknowledge the contributions of these folks here, including the National Climate Adaptation Science Center Eco Drought Working Group, but all of my interpretations are my own here. So, interesting. There we go. Okay, there's a big lag here in terms of slide advance. All right, when it comes to fire, we often think very simply about drought and fire. We know intuitively and from a huge body of great research that when it's dry and warm, fires are bigger, they're more numerous, they're more severe. Our experience with drought and fire, though, depends a lot on the ecosystems in which we live and work. And the way we think about drought influences on fire depend a lot on the perspectives that we bring with us. So it's more complicated than that. It's not just when it's drier outside, there's more fire on the landscape, although generally that's true. In some ecosystems, the relationship between drought and fire really is just about that simple. The drier it is, the more ignitions there are, the more likely they are to become larger fires that have higher intensities, that have more severe impacts, and present greater challenges for fire management and fire suppression, firefighting, that sort of thing, and thus present us with the challenging risks that we face. That said, there are a lot of ecosystems in the Western United States and around the world where the largest areas that burn co-occur with warmer and drier seasons, but where wetter conditions prior to the fire season drive fires as much or more in terms of predictability. So most years in many of those systems are dry enough for fire to ignite, to spread, to become an issue. But the years with the largest areas burns often are preceded by abnormally wet years. This varies from system to system around the planet, and it presents some significant challenges for how we think about the relationship between drought and fire going forward in a climate change future. While it's almost universally true that the drier years are those that present us with the largest management challenges, it's also true that there's longer antecedent climate influences that affect how those droughts affect fire and whether or not they become even greater challenges to management. So we've done a lot of work trying to understand the different climatic predictors of area burned by fire in ecosystems across the Western US. And to some degree, these are a microcosm of fire around the planet, although there are many places that don't fit this general model. But one of the things that we found is that there's a continuum or a gradient between those very simple systems where drought seems to beget fire pretty universally, and where multiple years of drought affect fire in similar ways, on one hand. And then on the other hand, where that's not necessarily the main predictor, and in many cases, even where it's almost required to have a wetter year in the years prior to fire that occurs. So these are really different characteristics of different ecosystems. And in the map on the right here, I've presented different ecosections. These are Bailey's ecosections across the Western United States. And for each one of these polygons with a cryptic numeric label on it, there's a specific history of fire that's been related to the climate drivers that are most significantly related to it in a statistical sense. The green ones are, the darkest green ones especially, are these ecosystems where the pattern fits the very intuitive more drought equals more fire. The largest areas burn in the years that are driest, and the ways that fire develops over the fire season depend a lot on the drought conditions in antecedent years, and fit our general model of fire and drought. The ones that are in the tan colors are that contrasting setup where you've got an increase in precipitation or a decrease in temperature in year or years prior, or even seasons prior to fire. And then even a normally dry year is sufficient to have very large areas burned, but you kind of get a 1-2 punch with a bigger drought. So drought's always important, it's not to say that it's not, but the way that it fits into the antecedent climate that leads up to the fire season depends a lot on the fuels in these systems. And so what we've tried to characterize here is the different ways that fuels affect the drought sensitivity to fire. So these relationships are ecosystem dependent. And I've listed here a bunch of the different characteristic variables that you find in the literature that fit these different storylines. And usually these flammability limited systems, which are the green ones, are where the year of or the year prior climate and drought are very similar, and you get a bigger impact with subsequent years of drought. And that fits this kind of global change narrative that we hear too, with increasing temperature and in some places decreased precipitation, snowpack. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then contrasting that with these fuel limited places where usually the year prior and how wet and conducive it is to vegetation growth and fuel development, that's a big important part of those systems. So if we think about then the time scales and the spatial scales at which drought influences fire, this is a figure that we developed for a paper a few years back, trying to put fire events and drought and fire regimes into a spatial and temporal domain that describes how all of these pieces fit together. It's true that often you'll hear from fire researchers, fire managers, that it really depends on the weather that influences fire behavior during the fire season, and it always comes down to that. But the degree to which these preceding climate conditions affect those responses, that's something that we're very interested in understanding as we go forward into a climate change future. In some ways, they may help us forecast and predict a little bit better the kinds of challenges that we face year to year, season to season. And in other cases, they help us plan for the much longer term, depending on how these relationships unfold. So in the long term, climate determines the vegetation that occurs in a place, how productive that vegetation is, so how much fuel there is or can be expected to be, and in part how they're arranged on landscapes that we live and work within. In the short term, the weather events affect where and how fires burn. So it's always important to think both about the fire behavior during the fire season, but then also that pre-setup that occurs in the long-term years or seasons before that. In between that, that's where the climate and droughts really affect and aggregate to determine the fire regimes that we get in the long term. So over many fire events and many drought events, you get the emergence of a fire regime that's characteristic to a place. But it's true that from time to time in a particular place with climate variability, and from place to place within a certain time, given the vegetation and topographic and landscape differences, all of these affect how drought plays out in a particular place. So now I'm going to diverge a little bit and try to relate this to some of the ecological drought literature and focus on some of the timescales that is in the recent paper from Krausbay et al., which I encourage you to read. There's some really interesting stuff in there. This is the first temporal scale we often think about is that one I talked about a minute ago with fire behavior. We can easily fall into the trap that the large, severe, and intense fires we observe on the landscape are only driven by the short-term events that came right before or even during those fires. And there's a large literature on the fire behavior that results from specific kinds of drought or ignitions or lack of precipitation or wind, the fire climatology and fire weather during and just prior to fire events. And this is kind of consistent with the flash drought timescale, the time in days or weeks leading up to fire events, and that influences how we think about fire hazard, fire danger, all these variables that people tend to use to characterize both the hazard of fire, the probability we're going to have large fires ignite and spread, but then also the fuel characteristics that may determine whether fuels are available enough and flammable enough for those fire events. So that's this flash drought in the ecological drought hierarchy in time, and it's consistent with synoptic weather, and occurs from local to broad ecoregional scales, even subcontinental scales, but is shorter in time. That's contingent on what went before to some degree, though. We know, for example, as the winter develops, what our snowpack looks like in some places that are dependent on snow, mountainous parts of the western U.S., for example. And the snow drought development can occur in such a way that, depending on what happens during the fire season, we can either be at much elevated risk, or if the fire season turns out to be fairly normal or even abnormally low in terms of its danger, then it can override this preceding effect. But when we get summertime fire weather that's extreme, at the same time that we had a snow drought developing over the weeks and months preceding the fire season, then we get sort of that added influence and much larger fires than we would otherwise expect. So there's really good science showing that the seasons and even years leading up to the fire season can precondition landscapes to be more flammable than we might expect otherwise. Snow drought's a great example of that. It's not the only mechanism by which this occurs, and certainly not everywhere is snow dependent in terms of its fire response, but we see a really well-developed fire climate literature that this kind of drought has a particular impact that's important going forward, especially as we see a decline in snowpacks around the West. And then if we think about even further out in the time scale, so many years to decades, we know that at these time scales, the change in climate, for example, we've seen the hotter temperatures in the last decades driven by global change, and the droughts that we see in response to these are really different than we would expect for similar absence of precipitation. So it's not just a lack of rain or snow, it's also the changing baseline climate and the temperatures that are influencing the potential impacts. These long-term trends in fire occurrence and fire area burned and the novel fire conditions observed in recent years are just another example of this, where at the longer time scales, we're starting to talk about fire regimes, a collection of many fire events that are characterized by different expectations than we had in our historical period. And so the fire weather that we get in a particular fire season is dependent on the impacts of these kinds of events over even longer time periods. And then at the longest time scales, we think about what paleoclimate reconstructions have to say about the really long-term characteristics of the climate system. At regional to continental scales, we know from the paleoclimate record that the vegetation is changing with that persistent climate variability over long periods of time. And that's modifying even in the in forested ecosystems where forests take a long time to develop. This is modifying the fuel availability that's in those landscapes and characteristic of them. Some other ecosystems respond much more quickly in terms of their fuel availability, but at these time scales, all of them are responding. So the role of fire in ecosystems varies at these time scales too. So the drought-fire relationship is really much more complicated than just when it's dry, there's more fire on the landscape, although that is of course true. And the long-term thinking that goes into where we're at in a particular time is influenced both by the past influences on vegetation availability. And as we look to a climate change future, we have to consider both those vegetation responses and the climate changes that are affecting the way that drought is affecting the fuels on the landscape. So if we think a little bit forward then in the future, these are just maps that show climate change projections over many climate models for the end of the 21st century under a warmer emission scenario consistent with the RCP 8.5. So this is kind of the higher warming range from the more recent round of climate models. You can see in the top graphic, I'm showing you North America and the change in near surface soil moisture. And that's just the amount of moisture available on average in the top layer of soil, and thus an indicator of water that's available to plants to some degree. And you can see the browns indicate drying, the greens indicate more moisture availability. And there's a large fraction of the continent for which there's a decrease in soil moisture. But it's interesting to look at the graphic below that, which shows you the change in total runoff, and look at some contrast here. If you look, for example, at the southwestern US, New Mexico, eastern Arizona, Texas, you see decreases in total runoff that would come from decreases in precipitation. And then on the top panel, you also see a decrease in the surface soil moisture, which is exactly what you'd expect, right? That's a drought relative to historical conditions. But then if you look, for example, in Western Canada and Alaska, you see an increase in runoff, but still a decrease in that soil moisture. And this is a clue to the fact that we have to pay attention to carefully understanding the influence of both temperature and precipitation and the ways that water is stored in the soil and available to plants. And it really has implications for how we think about future fire risk. In Alaska, for example, it's very common for people to think, well, we get an increase in precipitation, increase in runoff, that's a wetter future. But the increased potential evapotranspiration, so how much water the atmosphere can pull out of plants and the land surface, has increased enough that you still get a drier future and potentially more fire. So it's a little bit of a paradox. This has consequences for what we mean by drought. We have to think carefully about the differences between meteorological, hydrological, agricultural, and ecological drought, and where we're coming from in terms of the future that we're planning for. So anticipating future climate change impacts on fire really depends on where we think of ourselves and our fuels and our landscapes in this drought world. In the work that we've done trying to characterize different ecosystems and their trajectories in the future in terms of climate and fire, we've spent a lot of time understanding the ways that water availability and the demand for that water from the climate system affect fire. And these are the differences, for example, between potential evapotranspiration, which is how much water the atmosphere can pull from plants and the land surface, and then how much water there is to give actual evapotranspiration, so the plants will use effectively as much as they can. The difference between those has a lot to say about fire in many of the ecosystems in the Western US. And so we've taken a lot of time to project forward how those ecosystems might look in terms of their future fire hazard, given what we know about the differences between potential and actual evapotranspiration. The graphic on the right just has a dot for each of those ecosections in the Western US that I showed you earlier, and then an orange and red arrow for the 2040s and 2080s trajectories in that space. As you move to the right along the potential evapotranspiration axis, if nothing else changes, you would be getting into a drier world. But you see, not all of these ecosections do that. Some of them go to the right and become what we would expect drier. Others go down and to the right, which is even drier still. But yet others change in other directions. And so it really depends on the fuel and landscape characteristics in these environments as to what we expect in the future. As vegetation and climate change into the future, then the fire responses to different kinds of drought and different landscapes result in increasingly novel conditions. So if the vegetation is also changing while the fire is changing, you're departing from places that you might recognize historically in terms of the fire and drought relationships you expect. So our historical experience is no longer a good reference frame in that case. In that sense, they're non-stationary, and they're examples of ecological transformation. At some point, that ecosystem doesn't look anything like the place that led to the relationships that we're describing. And in that case, these projections for future fire become increasingly they become increasingly novel. So in a non-stationary world, the longer the manager's experience with the variability in that landscape, the better they're going to understand how those change outcomes may affect the fire management that they're facing. Inevitably, there'll also be surprises because there's things that we just haven't considered in these kinds of projections. But the point I'm trying to make is that eventually you get to a point where the models and historical reference frame that you're bringing to the management world is no longer representative of the one that we're moving into, and that's where that experience becomes really important. So for a decade or more, I think we've focused a lot on the exposure and the sensitivity at the expense of adaptive capacity in this discussion. Drought impacts on fire are something that we've collectively spent a lot of time and scientific effort trying to understand, and we're doing a fairly good job of that, I think. But we know that the impacts and risks are quite large, and that the adaptive capacity in places where fire management is a challenge and the vulnerability to risks from fire are definitely the places where we would like to be doing more of this work. And I think if you follow the literature on drought and fire, you see that that's rapidly emerging, and it is being reimagined both in the scientific community and, as Bill will tell you, in the applications community, which I think is really exciting. I want to take a second and characterize this a little bit. In the drought fire research world, we've spent quite a bit of effort doing what's called systems knowledge work, trying to understand how the natural system works, how it affects things that are important to people. And I've tried to describe here a little bit about the influences of drought on fire and how that varies with regional climate and fuels, how it might affect landscape vegetation dynamics in the future. And this is key to understanding what we might expect in terms of future ecosystems, future fire relationships with drought, future management challenges given fire. But that's not enough in the world that we would like to see, right? We want to understand under climate change, and especially in this novel or non-stationary fire world, we'd like to understand a bit more about how we might respond differently than we have in the past to affect the changes in these landscapes to the extent we can, and thus do what's more of an adaptive approach. That's more like target knowledge. How do we change, or how do we use our systems knowledge to change the outcomes of the system that we're working within? And in this case, that means things like fuels management and how that affects fire, how fire affects fuels, what that means for water management. So we'd like to see this have, of course, more of a human dimension. And there's a huge literature on this as well. And we know from lots of experience around the Western US how this works and how the different approaches to full suppression versus fire use and things like that result in different changes in different ecosystems. But putting all of that together is the challenge, right? How do we manage changes in fire regimes and the consequences for landscapes and people? That depends on the systems knowledge, on the target knowledge, and how we implement them. And I don't have time to go into all of these questions that I've listed here that might frame this dialogue. And you see research on some of these, but this is really where, in an ecological drought sense, we're headed. And I want to point out the last one. What knowledges can we include in the strategies that we develop as we go forward, that develop, for example, the adaptation strategies that we might trial, the ways we might actually do work in landscapes. Bill may talk in a minute about the use of fire and the history that they have as fire managers in that landscape. And that's a key aspect of this. Without that experience, the models that we develop don't do as well, for example, at understanding what adaptation approaches we might use. So to put it all together then, I've made it very complicated, but here's a complicated figure that we've developed to try and understand the ways that fire management and when and where in the fire process we might expect to be able to change the trajectories of these responses based on our management of fire and fuels and on ourselves. This puts together the systems knowledge, the target knowledge, and the transformation knowledge that I talked about by pointing out the portions of what's called the adaptive cycle. This is from the Panarchy literature on conservation. And you can think about adaptive cycles as responses to events that occur. And in this case, if you have a drought event that influences fire, and then changes in the system that result from that, you get the opportunity to either affect that desired future trajectory through management responses, or in some cases to experience the same cycle again, depending on the choices that are made. And studying the different points of this, rather than just the drought and fire relationships or the initial management of fire, is really where I think we can make a lot of strides in the future. Applying our knowledges deliberately in fire management for the future can allow us to act in ways that respond to the non-stationarity in climate, fire, and landscapes. So in that sense, we can be more ready by having increased knowledge of this part of the the story. The risk, though, is that we're operating in brand new territory. Our historical reference frames are helpful in this regard, but they don't tell us everything we need to know. The benefit is that we may succeed in decreasing vulnerability by increasing our adaptive capacity and getting out of just the drought and fire part of the research. And the ecological drought framework really allows a nice potential for doing this work going forward, I think. So to sum up, it's clear that we need better drought forecasting, better predictions of fire and climate impacts on fire, better understanding of the climate fire futures. All of those are needed as tools in managing the future landscapes in the West and indeed globally. And using ecological drought as an organizing concept brings in people and their ability to affect both landscapes and the adaptive capacity. So I really like that potential. We can use our understanding of drought and fire as part of decisions to resist change, adapt to it, or direct it. So the RAD framework, where we understand more about our future and have some control over it by doing more of the adaptive work that's indicated by the science. In terms of systems knowledge, we think of drought as an eco-hydrologic process, but that's not enough for the wicked problem that fire is. People, their ignitions, their management choices, their vulnerabilities and risks, all of that plays into how we do this work going forward, and should be a big component of the research. And ecological drought provides an avenue for that. And then transformational knowledge is what's needed here. It's not just the systems or the target knowledge, and that comes from experience. And this is where I wanted to segue to some of the things that Bill might say, and point out that different knowledges of fire and fire in landscapes give us a lot of information and tools for using fire as part of this adaptive cycle. It's not just the predictions that come from models. I often say that models need to get outside more and experience that real world. And that's where the trialing of future adaptations can be informed by the experience of fire managers in the real world, and thus modeled forward potentially in some of the fire modeling work that we do. So with that, I wanted to conclude, and I know now that we should transition, I guess, directly to Paul, and I'm gonna.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeremy. We'll hand over to Paul Steblin now, the Wildland Fire Science Coordinator for USGS. And after Paul, we'll have Bill Tripp speak, the Director of Natural Resources and Environmental Policy at the Department of Natural Resources for the Karuk Tribe. So thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yep, it's perfect.
Okay. Hi, I'm Paul Steblin, and thank you for the introduction. And I'm glad Jeremy went first. He covered a lot of things, and I think mine will complement it and maybe expand out a little bit. I had only a couple hours to put some things together, so this is a novel presentation for me, and I hope it's valuable. We do have a wide variety of fire science at US Geological Survey. There's a number of sources available. You'll hear some of it in the talk, and then I'll be particularly emphasizing some of the areas of our new strategic plan that may relate to this topic. Joint Fire Science is another program that I'm involved with, and they are addressing this topic in a variety of ways as well. So the scope of USGS fire science in general is pretty broad and diverse and detailed in many ways. Jeremy is one of our fine scientists. Regarding the scope of our work, it's national for some aspects. For example, a lot of data sets that you may be familiar with, such as land fire or the national map or LIDAR data, or many of the other types of assessments that are done at a national level, cover all lands, all areas. We also have a special relationship with the Department of Interior. USGS has a science focus on DOI lands, and that comprises 20% of the land surface. And the map to the right illustrates those land areas. And some of our field stations in science was focused on specific units back when science was divisions in the different land management agencies. Back in the 90s, that was brought into the National Biological Survey. And so there are local and regional scope projects. And the emphasis for our fire science, where we contrast with others, is many of our areas are in non-forested sites, such as the deserts, sage steppe, or the chaparral, or the tundra, or the swamps and wetlands, as opposed to the forested areas where fire science from Forest Service is focused. We are also interdisciplinary. So we have about 150 scientists working across all our different mission areas in multiple disciplines within those mission areas. So in general, the 4 types, and this is an arbitrary characterization, but fire history and management, fire ecology and recovery, post-fire risk, and geospatial imagery and technology. And we have a lot of information available that goes into great detail on those. As an organization, we have a community of practice, and as I mentioned, there's over 150 actually people involved in that, and producing about 90 publications a year. One of those areas that has been a focus that ties to drought and fire is the sage steppe. When I was a manager out at Sheldon and Hart Mountain National Wildlife Refuges, it was a 1 million acre complex landscape that I worked with, and was very surprised to see what the role of an invasive species, a fire adapted invasive species like cheatgrass, can have upon a very remote and otherwise relatively pristine system. Grazing, of course, was an issue out there, but cheatgrass has flipped upside down the fire regime. And what Jeremy was talking about on those eco sections, Bailey's eco sections, was great description of what we experienced there, that you can have a moist year and a flush of growth, including with the cheatgrass, and then it cures the next year, or it's extraordinarily dry and you get a fire with some wind, and the cheatgrass carries the fire across the discontinuous fuels of the sagebrush steppe. And then depending upon the weather conditions, you may or may not have sagebrush and bunchgrass germinating after the fire in the fall or the following spring. And that made it very difficult then to plan recovery. But anyways, the cheatgrass really has flipped upside down from a fire return interval that could be from 35 to 700 years to between 10 and 20 years, and has shifted a lot of the sagebrush steppe into a more monotypic cheatgrass stand or grassland stand. The research for this that we've been doing was captured in an actionable science plan that USGS with JFSP, with the Bureau of Land Management, many other partners put together a science plan. We've been implementing that, and in the next year to 2 years, we are reviewing the science that's been accomplished since that was put together. It includes sections on fire, sagebrush and sage grouse, climate change, and recovery. It's quite a lot of effort went into that, and I think has made a good focused effort to fill those needs. When I first came on board a couple years ago, learning about the different kinds of research we did, I tried to put it into a story map. Ann Kinzinger, one of our associate directors, does a great job framing it as phases of a fire, before, during, and after a fire. And so I tried to use that as a story map, had a few of the key areas that we did. But in fire and many other natural hazards, the context is really what's the risk framework for that. And so this is taking it further to identify the threats and hazards, which are the plain text, and I have drought and climate change there, invasive species and others, along with the values that are at risk. And so using the Thompson-Culkin framework for fire risk, what are the values that are susceptible to being impacted negatively or positively by threats and hazards? And then what are the mitigation type actions that can take place? And so this helps, it's complex, but it helps to understand how it all fits together, and especially with a diverse portfolio of science that we have for fire at USGS or some of the other agencies as well. But some of the important aspects of it is understanding how they relate through this cycle, and where are the action points that Jeremy was talking about that management can take, can be done to reduce the risk, and understanding what drives the system and what are the management options. So one of my primary charge when I came on board was to develop a fire science program for USGS, and to do that we had to develop a strategic plan. Some of the key factors that drove that were the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy, or Cohesive Strategy, which was called for in the Flame Act of 2009. The fire, certainly the needs of our stakeholders, our partners, are critical. And so the Wildland Fire Leadership Council, Western Governors Association, National Interagency Fire Center, and the other governing organizations are key stakeholders that we work with and understand what those needs are. We also did extensive stakeholder interviews, which you'll hear a little bit about, and presented updates at meetings and conferences. Some of the principles that we wanted to apply were matching US science capability with stakeholder needs. So what is their niche? How do we apply that? Use interdisciplinary approach. As you can see from some of these diagrams, it is pretty complicated, and no one person, no one discipline, no one group can address it all. So how do we do that? And then adaptive, taking advantage of new technology, new knowledge, and understanding the needs as they emerge to try and adapt to meet that. And this is our first plan. So we interviewed 40 organizations. I'll go through this kind of quickly. 40 organizations representing pretty diverse variety of stakeholders. And then those needs. Did someone mute the microphone out there? Anyways, I'll try and talk over it. Characterize those science needs into different categories. And as you see from this, the size of the rectangle is emblematic of the importance, or how many stakeholders identified it. But climate, fuels, social science, fire effects, those are things that you would expect, but climate came out the #1 particular item for a research need. One of the interesting things, and I think a fairly unique aspect of our characterization of it, was planning for uncertainty was a key area of new information needs that needed to be met. When you have managers saying, I don't know what to manage for 50 years out, or 30 years out, or 10 years out because of climate change and other ecological drivers, that is certainly uncertainty in trying to figure out what to do, as well as even understanding, characterizing what the changing effect of climate, drought, and other things on fire regimes, as Jeremy talked about, and then science practices and data needs. So with all of that kind of informing our strategic planning process, we came up with 4 priorities. Priority 1 is more of the traditional science plan, so state-of-the-art actionable fire science. I'll go into that with a little depth. And then priority 2 is engaging stakeholders in science production. And I'm not going to go into too much more detail about that, but there's 2 aspects. One is using a co-production approach. So we're working with managers, practitioners through the process to identify what the needs are, the design of the science, and then shaping the delivery so that it is usable for the managers. The other part is focuses on science delivery and working particularly with, in our plan we propose, working closely with the Fire Science Exchange Network that's funded by JFSP. So we take advantage of an organization and infrastructure that's already there to deliver science more effectively and understand at those levels and locations what the needs are. Effectively communicate, it's always about communication. And then priority 4 is organizational excellence inside the USGS so we can better address priorities and work in an integrated fashion. And then also with external partners, so we have our capability matching up with other organizational and expertise, their capabilities. the first goal is really about climate change and other stressors, and I don't have time to go into much detail, but really looking at the changing fire regimes, what are the impacts that this has on species and ecosystems, understanding burn severity. Hear a lot about the changing fire intensity and how when you can go out some places it looks like a moonscape. Well, what's going on? Why is that happening? How is it affecting things? And then coupling models together to deal with the complex interacting factors. Goal 2 is relationship of fire and fire management to conservation, biodiversity, our ecosystems, and recovery. That's one of the key missions of the Department of Interior. And from an ecological standpoint, one of the biggest challenges we're facing. And so a variety of strategies to deal with that. So dealing with the human aspect, with lives, livelihoods, property, and infrastructure, what kind of science will help address fire-adapted communities, which is one of the goals of the cohesive strategy, prevent catastrophic fires in wildland-urban interface, human health and safety, and then integrity of traditional lands and resources. We have a focus on our tribal responsibilities as well. And the last goal is state-of-the-art tools and decision support systems. And so we're looking at some things like really enhanced fire behavior models and fire effects, dealing with some of the collateral things such as smoke emissions and dispersion, and with an emphasis on non-forested systems, and then using advancing computer technology and sensors. So I think this may be my last slide or close to the last slide, but so how do you take this complex of science capability, needs, and other things? And so this is a conceptual diagram where we're trying to figure out a way to implement this in a progressive way. It also provides a framework of how do you take a complex set of sciences that are tied into fire and do it in not simple steps, but at least steps that can be managed. And so over here on the left side, we have one team that has developed a proposal for coupling fire behavior models with post-fire hazard assessment and recovery. And so we just got funding, and we're starting on the upper left corner to predict burn severity and burn area from current fire behavior models, so that we can link in debris flow, water quality, and water flow, and have an enhanced characterization of the direct and indirect effects of fire. There's other things such as near real-time or real-time fire detection, coming up with an enterprise information architecture that can accommodate the diversity and breadth of the data, models, and information, and make it accessible, and so that we can work more effectively with the vast amount of data that's produced by the fire management community and other hazards. So anyways, one other thing to point out is over to the right, part of that is also then to build into this framework capability to tie in with climate, weather, both seasonal and multi-annual, short and long-term changes of environmental conditions that are critical to characterizing fire behavior. And then this is my last slide. Again, the 4 priorities are advance integrated actionable fire science that deals with complex and dynamic challenges, listen to and work with the stakeholders to identify needs, do the science, and deliver the results. Communication to ensure the public knows what we do, where we get the results, and what it means. And then really enhance our collaboration within USGS and with our partners outside of USGS. And so we'll be working with our stakeholders to develop an action plan. That's all I have.
All right, thank you very much, Paul. And thank you again for being so flexible to present today at such short notice. And now we will turn over to Bill Tripp. And I recognize that we are running low on time. We would if folks want to stay on the line, we do have some good questions already for the speakers who have presented, and there are some for you also, Bill. Hopefully folks could stay a little over time. We'll see if our speakers can stay over time. Can you see the slide? I need to show it. Can you see that now?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead, Bill, and thank you.
All right, thank you. Yeah, there's a couple of great presentations, Jeremy and Paul. Thanks, Paul, for stepping in to cover for me. I was getting called away to a closed session meeting with our tribal council, and then our email server crashed, so I could not communicate with folks. But they helped me make some adjustments, and my 2 o'clock also got canceled, so I can't stay. To not burn any more time, ecological drought. Ecological drought brings me straight to our fire deficit. We've got a century or more of fire exclusion that has occurred in Ecological territory in northwestern California, even more so the further east you go. So a lot of times we think in terms of natural systems, and from the indigenous point of view and traditional ecological knowledge, we view ourselves as being part of that natural system, and the term indigenous means natural to place in itself. And so what does that mean as far as these relationships go in a changing climate? Those are tough answers to ask. We've been here for thousands of years working in these systems and being natural to place, and then have been abruptly removed from those systems in any meaningful manner, and our knowledge, practice, and belief systems that were integral to survival in this place through change have been disrupted. Now the principles behind our practices in those systems remain valid as far as I can tell into any kind of change we see. But as you heard from Paul, sometimes managing for the unknown can be quite difficult, especially if you need to document these in big, long, drawn-out planning processes. So, an example of the situation that we look at here with a century of fire exclusion and removal of indigenous knowledge, practice, and belief systems from these local landscapes is, the reality of our world today is that 98% of wildfires are caught at initial attack. And, and less than 2% of those end up turning into, less than 2% end up turning into large fires. In 2020, we had 2 very large fires here in Ecological territory. We had the Red Salmon Complex and the Slater Fire. The Slater Fire burned down 200 homes and took 2 lives. This is becoming quite a common storyline in the West. And it's one that we urgently need to turn around. The Red Salmon Complex occurred in a place that's burned 4 times in the past 21 years with large fires. Its remote nature is just lends itself to ending up being the low priority fire that becomes one of those less than 2% large fires when we get these lightning events moving through the area. So we know that that's going to be a low priority fire, and we also know that there's some things that we could probably do about it. You know, the cost of the fires that have happened up there in the area of the Red Salmon Complex averaged over 65 million per occurrence, with the highest two being at about $150 million each. And so, you know, we're spending a lot of money on the back end to respond to things in a manner that's, you know, in a circumstance that's beyond our control. But, you know, if we can get out there on the front end and put some of these practices back in place, you know, there's places up there that are sacred to us as Cuttock people that where you know, people would go to pray and to hunt and to gather and to light fires for the benefit of all of those things. And in lighting those fires in those places, you know, you're working with the wind and the weather that occurs. And the indicators are tied specifically to these natural systems. And so, you know, those particular things are still valid. Those indicators are still remain valid today. It's just we are enabled to go and implement those practices. And so we established our climate adaptation plan as a foundation for trying to build these practices back into place. You know, and you know, I can go into so much more on that, and I can put a copy of it into chat once we go into questions. But the you know, we've been taught that we learn from the animals. You know, we used to have salmon that ran up these rivers all summer long. We don't have very many salmon left, and there's a lot of species that are declining very quickly. And you know, if you look hard enough, you can find a linkage between people, food systems, and ecological processes such as fire being out of balance to some degree in the root cause. And so, not forgetting that social component when we're looking at the triple bottom line there and looking at the social, economic, and ecological factors we face in our changing climate today. So, you know, I would encourage folks to get a hold of this climate adaptation plan if you haven't already, and dig into it for a greater perspective and understanding of where we are coming from people indigenous to this place, or as people indigenous to this place. And let's work to you know, implement the cohesive strategy and you know, do things. There's things we can do like creating smoke to lower temperatures and effective evapotranspiration and all of those things that were discussed in Jeremy's presentation, and they're outlined to some degree of detail in that plan. But like I said, it's a foundation, and it's something that we need to build upon. And in order to do that, we're working to reorganize our whole systems of work here in departmental reorganization, the way we establish our partnerships and who's being responsible for what components, who's dealing with invasives, who's dealing with wildlife, who's doing research and monitoring, K through 12 engagement, all of these things. And so with that, we are at 2 o'clock, and so I probably should go ahead and cut it off. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill. It's really great to hear your experience and knowledge based on so many years of adaptation experience and what your tribe is doing. So now we are going to go to your questions as soon as I can get myself organized here. So Bill, I think this question is for you. Is there a role for Indigenous knowledge in understanding the historical context of fire to fill in gaps where data doesn't exist, which, you know, environments where there just isn't much data from satellite imagery or on the ground data collection?
Yes, there is. And maybe I can link another thing in the chat here in a minute on how we approached our NEPA analysis for the Somes Bar Integrated Wildland Fire Management Project for the Western Climate Restoration Partnership. Is we founded the entirety of that project in TEK. In 2005, the Council on Environmental Quality accepted traditional ecological knowledge as a form of available science. And so, yes, when we're doing project planning and creating plans, well, there is the space to use that as your foundation, and then build your adaptation, your research and monitoring and adaptive management frameworks around it.
Thank you. This question, I think, would be great for all three speakers to speak to. What are best practices in terms of treatments after a wildfire has taken place? Should dead trees be removed to allow new growth and create more suitable habitat for post-fire recovery? Why don't we start with you, Bill? And then if Paul and Jeremy would also like to add on, that would be great.
You know, that's always a tough question. You know, the standard practices in the past, you know, have kind of been focused on economic resilience first. And I like to look at it from the perspective of ecological resilience first. And so it's situational and it's contextual. You know, if you end up leaving a bunch of trees along your most logical control features, where you know that you can use to put fire back in on a more frequent basis, you know, you're probably going to create a barrier to actually doing implementation. So, you know, removing some of those trees is probably, you know, not only a good thing, but probably critical to be able to actually affect the kind of change you need on that landscape. You know, and so it's important to not look at it from the perspective of, oh, well, there was 50,000 acres of plantations out there. We need to put it back in 50,000 acres of plantations, because 30 years later, you're going to be back in the same boat. You know, we're having situations now where the tree removal efforts on the Slater fire are taking out some of these big old black oak trees that you know, very likely could have survived the fire. They're not waiting to see if the bud break happens on them. And which is problematic, because it's that tree that provides your fuel bed to put frequent fire in. You know, that the name of Happy Camp, the Kuduk name translates to place where Hazel Creek grows through, and so just that, or flows through, and so that name itself implies that a majority of that watershed was dominated by a black oak hazel component on those southwest slopes that burned so intensely in that northeast wind event. And so if you can restore that type of a landscape and restore that type of an indigenous practice on that landscape, then there's no fuel there when that northeast wind event occurs.
Thank you, Bill. Paul, Jeremy, did you want to add anything to that?
I'll just add quickly that trees after a fire play a particular role in terms of nutrient source, habitat for organisms. It'll affect wind and other characteristics, also serves as fuel. There are quite a few, I would say quite a few studies that have been done looking at the post-fire environment and the roles that remaining trees or stems play. It's hard to give a simple generic answer, except that look at the best literature that's available for the region that you're in to understand and better inform decisions. And it does get back to what are your management objectives as well, wearing my old refuge manager hat. But there is a lot of information available, and I would look at that before I gave any specific answers.
Okay, thanks, Paul. We have quite a few more questions here. I think if it's okay with everyone, we'll go till about 3:15, and then let our speakers go. I'm sure you're busy. Let's see, is there research completed or underway on the implications of current and past grazing regimes to wildland fire? I'll just open it up for anyone to respond. Paul?
There's a lot of literature out there, and I would say there's a lot of variation in how those studies were set up. And I could see where there would be some benefits from grazing, for example, in selective removal of fine fuels that would certainly affect fire spread, fire ignitions and fire spread. But that again is a very complicated question with a lot of indirect and direct impacts that it would have on other components of the ecosystem, as well as fire behavior.
All right, thanks, Paul. Can you speak to the use of remotely sensed data to look at ecosystem response to fire, the best scale, how interpolation might impact the imagery or information, et.cetera?
Anybody else want to take that? I can answer, but I don't want to. So there would be, there's a lot of different kinds of remote sensing imagery and data that's available, and certainly others that are far better than me to address, but there are very exciting new kinds coming out. LiDAR, for instance, light imaging and detection, has incredible capabilities to do fine characterization of the terrain, to characterize. Some of the images I had were derived from LiDAR data to characterize 3 dimensions of fuel, and everything from grass blades on up to whole trees and forest. And so that, I think, is revolutionizing what we can do to characterize fuel, and being used for some of the most advanced fire behavior models, the physics-derived and fluid dynamic models that are newly becoming available. There's a lot of other hyperspectral data, which is just beginning to be used to fine-tune what part of the spectrum is being used. You can narrow it down to a particular species when it's greening up or blooming, or minerals that are in the soil. There are so many different both public and commercial sources available. I can put, see if I can find a link and put it into the chat for AROS is one of our big remote sensing centers and has probably some of the most diverse archives available of remote sensing data.
All right, great, thanks, Paul. This question is for anyone. I'll ask Bill to take it first. How does vegetation treatment, such as thinning, etc., benefit ecosystems and reduce fire risks? Are there situations in which vegetation treatment is not beneficial to ecosystems?
You know, I mean, again, it's situational and contextual. When we were doing our Stone Spar Integrated Wildland Fire Management Project, we started out with some of the tools that were just discussed with LiDAR and those types of things, and we went out and also walked the ground as part of our cultural resources inventory report. And so we looked at for that from the perspective of traditional food and fiber resources of the Kuduk people, as well as any indications of what types of focal species that we were looking at for the project that represented the diversity of that landscape. And so yes and no. we ended up finding places that, we ultimately, had a whole bunch of conifer trees that were 115 years old, every single one of them. Big, small, didn't really matter. Then there'd be like maybe 5 legacy trees that were much, much older. And so, that landscape never had many conifer trees on it. Indigenous peoples actually used that as a source of vitamin C and part of their diet for spring greens. And so a lot of times those conifer trees were actually pulled up and used when they were small rather than when we didn't have mills and things like that. So the some of those areas you really don't want to touch. It's just so remote. There's really no feasible way to get in there and do much about it other than just use fire. So we focused our approach at going where we could go to get more fire on the ground and use as a control feature both for prescribed fire and managed wildfire, and then look to just using fire only as the interior with some light treatment by hand, doing pullback or just some pile burning or whatever as needed to maintain that large tree component.
Thank you, Bill. And for everyone who is attending the webinar, Bill shared the link to the report that he just mentioned, the SOMSBAR Integrated Fire Management Project report, and it's in the chat section of the GoToWebinar control panel, that link, as well as a number of other links that have been shared by our speakers. So feel free to open that chat window and you can see that, access the links directly. All right, as we model fire risk and work to implement strategies to proactively mitigate those risks, how can we, quote, prove that we have prevented fires or fire damage compared to what would have happened without such efforts?
That's a great question, and can be a challenging one. One of the most common methods and what we're working on improving capability to do is to do what if scenarios. So what would happen if you did a certain amount of mitigation work to reduce fuels and to reduce fire risk across the landscape at different levels and different kinds and locations for those treatments, and then use a fire simulation model then to look at what the effect would be. In terms of the investment that's being made with treatments now, there is an increased effort to systematically capture what those treatments are, where they are, and then again doing fire simulation to determine what happens if there's a fire or not, or what kinds of fires, and see if it really does change the risk profile, the potential impact on values that are important. And of course, the ultimate test is if in fact future fires intersect with the treatments, and are we seeing differences in fire behavior and what the effects that are having. In some cases, in many cases, the evidence is that fuel treatments are changing the vulnerability of areas to fire, but there are certain environmental conditions where fires are going right through fire adapted communities and fuel treatment areas and still having substantial negative effects. And these are the single digit humidity, high temperature, and windy situations where you have extreme events taking place. So you can do it, just to summarize, you can do it in the future, hypothetically, where are the best places and what types of treatments. You can do it with, this is the inventory of treatments that is being done and what the change of risk profile is, and use simulations to help understand what that change, and then actual on the ground intersections between fuel treatments and fires.
I think scale of your activity is important there as well. You know, it's like traditionally we burn very intensively 2 miles out from where our permanent homes were. And you know, the reports that coming back from firefighters on these during these northeast wind events are consistently saying the fire was spotting 2 miles out and there was just mass area ignition. And so, you know, think of it from that perspective. If you got a 4-mile diameter around your community, that doesn't have so much fuel on the ground that's receptive to embers. You know, you should be able to significantly reduce that mass area ignition component during those events, but that takes a lot of maintenance.
Great responses, thank you. I promised you all I would let you go, but there is a very interesting question here that I'd love to hear your responses to. And I'm going to actually combine two questions that we have. One is, to what extent are human health considerations incorporated within broader ecological fire research? And related to that, how can we minimize fire impacts to water quality? I just wanted to try to tease out a little bit more around human health, water quality issues in relation to wildfire. So if you could speak to those, and then we will wrap up the webinar, that would be great.
Sure, this is Jeremy. One of the impacts that we see in the boreal north is especially interesting for rural and Alaska Natives and Canadian Indigenous communities, and that is that they're often off the road system. And as we see an increase in fire and the number of severe fire seasons in the boreal forest, the smoke and particulate impacts in those communities are really increasing quite a bit. And it's true that if you live in a community that you have to fly or boat out of, if it's smoky enough to present a health issue, then you can't. It's also too smoky often to fly. And so a lot of these communities don't have access to safe places for elders and youth and anyone who's otherwise respiratory challenged. And so there's a big increase in disproportionate impact on a population that we didn't used to think of as having fire health impacts just from the smoke and particulate issues. Now in urban areas, those are more well studied, and especially in places like California, for example, there's a huge amount of research on impacts to people in urban areas from ex-urban fires and things like that. And then with respect to water quality, you know, there's a lot of what we used to think of as very rare, or even forests that were not thought of as fire prone. You know, those often are the places that surround community reservoirs and places that don't have adequate filtration for drinking water because it was never historically required. And now you see fires in those watersheds much more frequently, not just because of the fire deficit, but also because of new climate conditions and newly available fuels. And so you have a huge risk for some communities that don't have alternative water supplies. We see that in Alaska. We see it in much of the West.
Yeah, I think I might add that you know, a lot of the major water quality impacts that we're seeing are when the built environment burns, and so, you know, that's you get a lot of toxicity there. You know, as far as the wildland's concerned, we've been finding ways to mitigate some of the water quality impacts just through working with the resource advisors on large fire events. Some things, you know, you don't necessarily think of unless you have trained people right there to communicate that in the moment. And one of those is, you know, moving invasive species around on helicopter buckets. You know, that's a water quality issue. You get a species like, I don't know the scientific name, but they call it rock snot. Thrives single cell organism, thrives well in cold, fresh, clear water that has the potential to wipe out the food source for all the species that you know, that need those invertebrates for food. You know, that and things like you know, different diseases like Port Orford cedar root rot get moved around with those things. But we've found that we can bleach those buckets and mitigate those things, or use new buckets where we don't have those infections and those types of things.
Couple other excuse me, a couple other quick things. EPA, CDC, and Forest Service and DOI are collectively doing an assessment to try and contrast what is the health effects of smoke and emissions on wildfires versus prescribed fires. So to try and the common knowledge is prescribed fire has less impact on people's health from smoke than wildfires. But so they're actually going through the assessment to try and come up with the best scientific information to underpin that comparison. Particulate matter is the biggest focus in ozone and pre-smog elements from smoke and fires. But Bill hit on when it burns into the wildland urban environment and all the man-made plastics and other materials out there, releases all kinds of different species that are different and are very noxious to people's health. The last thing I'll say is that, but there are in the wildlands, there are things that are bad for people as well. Heavy metals in some of the bedrock soils that contain asbestos. You can release asbestos and other similar fibers. Another is once you burn off all the organic matter in the trees and stabilizing vegetation, it can release fungus, other organisms from the soil that people can get sick from, as well as you can have post-fire wind events that then create these dust storms and very bad air quality, as well as losing additional organic matter from the soil surfaces. That limits recovery.
Great answers. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jeremy, Paul, and Bill for sharing your expertise, your research, your practice, for answering so many questions. I really wish we had another hour with you to go through more questions and learn from you. We will follow up with everybody and send out a recording of this webinar. And we thank everyone for joining us today and for engaging in the Q&A. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to having everyone on our next webinar on March 17, which is Drought in Coastal Ecosystems. So have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you all for staying overtime. We really appreciate your time, especially that of the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.